We're excited to announce that our very own podcasting platform, Zencastr, has become a new sponsor to the show. Check out the podcast's discount link in our show notes and stay tuned for why we love using Zen for the podcast.
You're listening to the Archaeology Podcast Network.
You're listening to the Rock Art Podcast with Dr. Alan Garfinkel, a podcast about all things rock art. Send us your suggestions. Hello and welcome to the Rock Art Podcast, Episode 8 with Dr. Alan Garfinkel. Today, Dr. Garfinkel talks to Carlos Gallinger about bighorn sheep in California.
Hello out there in Archaeology Podcast land. This is Dr. Alan Garfinkel. I'm the president and founder of the California Rock Art Foundation. And what we do is we identify, evaluate, manage, and conserve rock art both in Alta California and in Baja California. We conduct field trips, we have trainings, exercise, we do research, and in every way possible, we try to preserve, protect, and coordinate treasures of Alta and Baja California rock art, of which there are many and diverse. We also work closely with Native Americans and partner with them to recognize and protect sacred sites. So for more info about the fabulous California Rock Art Foundation, you can go to carockart.org. Also, I'm open to give me a call, 805-312-2261. We would welcome sponsorship or underwriting, helping us to defray the costs of our podcasts, and also membership in California Rock Art Foundation. And of course, donations, since we are a 501c3 nonprofit scientific and educational corporation. God bless everyone out there in podcast land. This is Dr. Alan Garfinkel on the 8th installment of the Rock Art Podcast under the Archaeology Podcast Network. And if you have any questions or suggestions about this particular episode or the continuing rock art studies, give me a call or send me an email. You can reach me by phone at 805-312-2261 or at my email by Avram, that's AVRAM1952 at yahoo.com. We are absolutely honored to have a very unique guest today. His name is Carlos Gallinger. And Carlos is a unique person in my experience in that he has a remarkable background and has been studying the wild sheep, the desert bighorn sheep of the Great Basin, principally in the Western Mojave Desert, for most of his life. And he has studied their habits, their habitat, the associated prehistoric activities of native people in hunting the bighorn sheep, and also in displaying their images both on rock paintings and on petroglyphs, rock drawings. And with that, hello, Carlos.
Hello there, Alan.
How are you today?
I'm doing very well.
Great. Well, Carlos, maybe we should take a step back and tell the audience about how you ever became interested in the study and research on bighorn sheep and where you grew up and how you developed this passion. How's that?
Yeah, well, I guess that's what differentiates me from many other people is the time I've spent in the field. I was raised basically what they call a free-ranging child. And then most of my working career, I worked 12-hour shifts. So basically I had 14, 15 days of work and the rest of the time off. And I lived in Barstow, so I was right in the heart of bighorn sheep country.
Where did you grow up, Carlos?
Well, a little bit in Needles, California, and Barstow, California. So it's Mojave Desert, for those who are unfamiliar with the names. And then the last 20 years, I only worked like maybe 3 or 4 months a year in 12-hour shifts. So even when I worked, I was working 60 days a year. And the rest of the time, I often lived out in the desert, and I had a motorhome, and I lived out there, and that's kind of what I did. And I got into the bighorn sheep as a young man, really wanting to get into hunting deer. Back then, hunting was kind of normal, whereas now it's, frowned upon basically. So I've had a lot of interesting kind of stories in that way. And as I got deeper into it, many of my mentors, one in particular, told me if you really wanted to learn hunting, you had to learn archaeology because it was the study of hunter and gatherers. And this friend of mine, Lyle Richardson, this mentor, could often tell me in depth about the environment by me just saying, well, there's a glyph here, or I found a game trail, or some description, and he could often talk deep about it with having never been there. So I started learning this idea of trying to understand the landscape in a traditional way.
Tell us about your youth. I mean, I think you told me at one time that you, in fact, did spend some time in the Newberries as a child. Am I wrong?
Yes, well, my dad worked at a compressor plant in Newberry, and they ended up owning a ranch that was just at the bottom of just the base of Newberry Mountains, right below the Newberry Caves. And much of my time as a younger kid, like by the time I was 5 or 6, all the way up until I was in high school, a lot of our friends, it was not unusual to get our bows and arrows and just run around like wild men, just crazy, having a good time. And it was kind of just what we did.
Tell me a bit about the Newberry Mountains. Where are they? What are they? And why are they important to understand in this journey of your life?
Well, the Newberries is between basically the town of Newberry, which is on Old 66, and Barstow. And they fill that gap. And it's a rugged, now considered legally a wilderness, but it was so rugged that most of your off-road dune buggies never really got into the interior of the Newberries. And there was always sheep there. It's a remnant herd. That is, that it always existed. So genetically, it has a lineage, unbroken lineage, back to the ancient times. And at one point, it was down to 25 head. It was hanging on by its fingernails.
So you're telling me that at some point in its history, the Newberry Mountains that are out in the eastern Mojave Desert only had how many bighorn sheep?
About 25, and that persisted for probably 50, maybe 100 years. Hard to say.
Now, I understand that when it gets down to that low, there's almost a certainty that that particular population could and does become extinct.
Yes, it was on its way out. I mean, it was without a doubt on its way out due to inbreeding.
Okay. Now, the Newberry Mountains are also famous for, as you said, the Newberry Caves, and you might want to introduce our audience to what the heck that's all about.
Well, the Newberry Caves was a major archaeological site that was excavated, I think, in the late 50s, early 60s, and had a lot to do with laying the groundwork for Great Basin archaeology in a whole. And I think you can correct me on this, a period of time known as the Little Palluvial, when many of the petroglyphs were carved and made, and that there was this culture that ascended that was a bighorn sheep culture, much like the Great Plains would have been the buffalo culture, or the Pacific Northwest, the salmon culture, and so on.
We're talking about a time that's maybe, 3,000 to 4,000 years ago, correct?
Yeah, and pre-bow and arrow, pre-pottery, as you well know.
Yeah.
It had a lot of what they call perishables in this cave. And one of the things that links up to this cave is there's undisturbed campsites going like off into the Ords or the Rodmans. And of course, the Rodmans have all these beautiful petroglyphs that are of the same era, as well as geoglyphs.
What's a geoglyph?
Well, it's an image or design that's on the ground that's made out of just rocks, where they just grabbed, mostly in the Newberries, they're, relatively small rocks, the size of a potato maybe, or maybe not bigger than a coffee can. And they make different designs. There's one that I believe is a broken arrow, a sheep, a sun, for lack of a better term. They're all over these images, and you'll find even a few places of, flakes and things like that, campsites, metates, and so on.
These geoglyphs are like, there's something like almost the Atacama Desert, where they actually take out rocks or put rocks in, and actually make rock pictures on the rocks, on that desert pavement, on that
Right.
heavily varnished basalt and other styles of rocks on the desert floor, right?
That is correct. And that's how even an amateur can look at it and say, well, that's very ancient, simply because it doesn't have the varnish on the bottom. Or
I
actually
see.
has usually a redder varnish. So it's kind of a no-brainer to actually see it and understand it as an ancient design rather than something done in the 60s or something.
But you were saying the Newberry Cave had some perishables in it?
Well, it had all kinds of things. It had spears and atlatls and split twig figures. And my assessment of cave site is that it was an ambush site and that there was water at the foot of the cave. And there was also mineral sources right around it. And I've got a long, drawn-out theory about when you bring mineral sources and water together, it amplifies the value to the animals.
So we have this cave in this Newberry Mountains. It has perishables in it. It dates from about 4,000 to 3,000 years old. And it has all of this material that's perishable that in fact normally doesn't preserve, but because it's in a cave, it's there. What were they doing there? Why does that cave exist anyways?
You know, most of the archaeology is based that it was a religious site. And without a doubt, it was in part that. But to me, what you have is a hunting blind that's been preserved, that the sandals and the lost arrowheads and the arrow or atlatl shafts and so on that would never be preserved elsewhere because there are plenty of hunting blinds, but they're exposed to the elements, and so all these other things would be vanished. They're gone. They're decayed. Whereas they were preserved in the cave. So we have, you know, a religious site, but we also have a practical site, a site that was an everyday, like, hey, I got to feed my family kind of site. And the tools of the hunters were there. And one of the things the archaeologists have going through and inventory and all this, they were quick to realize that there was not any or little sign of habitation of women or children. So this was not the main camp. The Newberry Caves was a place you went to hunt. And hunting was as much a religious activity to these ancient people as it was a practical. There was no separation in their mind, I don't think, between the two.
Now, this is sort of a hunting site and also a religious site. Was there any images there that were related to the hunt or anything that we might be able to understand?
Well, yes, there was the split twig figures, of which I actually think there's a split twig figure representation in the geoglyphs on the Rodmans. But the split twig figures, like one of them had a little spear in it, another one had an arrowhead wrapped in it, and of course the fact that one of these had each of these, you probably had the others. Many of these split twig figures are fragmentary, so they probably also had spears or arrowheads or other ideas of the hunt. May have had red paint on them, in a position of death. Who knows what they might have had. Sometimes the split twig figures do look like they're dead because the position of the legs are such that they're kind of closer together at the ends. And that's what happens when a sheep is dead, laying on its side in a relaxed position. The legs are a little closer to each other at the hoofs.
Can you explain briefly what a split twig figurine is?
Yeah, it's a phenomena that's actually throughout the Great Basin. You could probably expand on that, but I know it's in the Grand Canyon, quite prevalent. And they would split a twig, I think usually a willow, and just wad it up in such a way as it would make an image of a four-legged animal. And almost always, given the proportions, it would be a sheep or a deer.
Got it.
The proportions of the legs are different between the sheep and the deer, and most of them to me look sheep going off those proportions. But you know, a guy could just have done it a little short or long at one particular time, and we wouldn't know that.
Now I thought there was maybe some rock art at Newberry Cave. Am I right or wrong?
There's pictographs, no petroglyphs, but there are pictographs.
And what are those? What are pictographs?
They are paintings, basically.
Ah,
One of them appears to be a sheep in there, and then there's a handprint, which is, universal all over the world. And it's interesting, a lot of the pictographs there tend to be what we would call abstract. We don't know what they are. Sometimes glyphs, we know very much what they are. It's obvious, that it's a sheep or a person or an atlatl. Other times we really don't know what is being symbolically represented there. Although through the years I have found many glyphs that I would have thought was a one-off, and due to the miracle of digital photography, you find out that actually the image, it repeats sometimes hundreds of miles away. You just get it and you look at it and you say, man, that's the same thing. You're out in the Cosos and you see something that you say, man, I've seen that image in the Rodmans, or that symbol.
so in other words, I think what you're telling me is that these images, although we might think that they're random, are in fact patterned and constructed on some sort of a template or some sort of a regularized predictive example that was meaningful and had, some sort of implication and significance to the person that fashioned it. Am I correct?
Yeah, and I think you can look at parallels. You can look at trade languages that the Indians had, where they had 300-400 words that were universal to many groups or languages, or basically fixed symbols that meant something to everybody. But we'll never know what some of them are.
Yes, I agree. Well, maybe in this next segment, we're going to be able to get into the Newberry Bighorn sheep and sort of this journey, this evolution of what Carlos had done throughout his life to try to assist the herd in redeveloping, existing, and growing. And with that, we'll take a little bit of a break.
Chris Webster here for the Archaeology Podcast Network. We strive for high-quality interviews and content so you can find information on any topic in archaeology from around the world. One way we do that is by recording interviews with our hosts and guests located in many parts of the world all at once. We do that through the use of Zencastr. That's Zencastr. Zencastr allows us to record high-quality audio with no stress on the guest. Just send them a link to click on, and that's it. Zencastr does the rest. They even do automatic transcriptions. Check out the link in the show notes for 30% off your first 3 months, or go to zencastr.com and use the code ROCKART. Looking to expand your knowledge of X-rays and imaging in the archaeology field? Then check out An Introduction to Paleoradiography, a short online course offering professional training for archaeologists and affiliated disciplines. Created by archaeologist, radiographer, and lecturer James Elliott, the content of this course is based upon his research and teaching experience in higher education. It is approved by the Chartered Institute for Archaeologists as 4 hours of training. That's in the UK, for those of you that don't know. So don't miss out on this exciting opportunity for professional and personal development. For more information on pricing and course structure, visit paleoimaging.com. That's PALEO imaging.com, and look for the link in the show notes to this episode.
Welcome back. This is Dr. Alan Garfinkel, and you're listening to the Rock Art podcast on the Archaeology Podcast Network. We're honored and blessed to have Carlos Gallinger, a world-class wildlife specialist who is assisting us in understanding the habits and habitat of the desert bighorn sheep and its relationship to the archaeology and rock art of the Mojave Desert. And I think in this next segment, Carlos, I would really like to know where you went, and in this odyssey that you developed, how did you go from 25 sheep to somehow enhancing that very small and almost impossible situation to bring back the Newberry herd?
Okay, well, that's a kind of a long story. We'll try to make it compressed. So to start with, we know that the herd was down that far. They'd done aerial surveys. And more importantly, I was part of a genetic survey in which we extracted, a guy getting his PhD, extracted DNA, sheep DNA, from their pellets, their droppings. And I collected those for him. And he did the whole Southern California population of sheep. I mean, all over.
Oh, wow.
And one of the outcomes of that was that, one, genetically, they were the most inbred of any population, the Newberry herd.
Really?
And he could actually see that one of the events was the freeway in the 1960s. The DNA actually had little clocks, if you will, not to get too fine a point on it, he could actually see that the Katy Mountains and the Newberry Mountains were genetically linked until the 1960s.
Wow.
Now, sometime after about probably 1930, 1940, due to mining and the Depression, many sheep herds were wiped out. People went to mines. Many of the mines that were only worth mining had to be near water. These people were impoverished, and they shot sheep to eat. It was just that simple. And however many sheep came down is how many they shot. And it was just one of them things that, unintended consequences kind of thing. So this persisted clear into the year 2000 or so. And then I got word that there was sheep, because I had been gone all over the West and into Utah and Arizona and studying sheep in a wider range. When I got word that there was sheep at this quarry, now it was kind of odd that there would be sheep at this quarry, but I mean, they were blasting and there was this huge conveyor belt and people and bulldozers. But sure enough, I went there and there were sheep there burning there every day. It just was amazing. And one of the things to kind of bring the story, because there's a long story, but what I come to realize, which is a whole nother, almost could write a book about, that the quarry was blasting and ripping rock up. And that pulverized rock freed minerals. And the quarry people had put water for the sheep. The sheep would come down, as they would wet the road, the sheep would come down and lick the little puddles, and eventually they found a leaking valve on their water tank. And the sheep would come in every day and get that water, and then after a while I realized that it wasn't just the water, it was the minerals. And at the same time, we were putting water sources, because of bureaucracy, it getting tough to put water sources in the desert.
So who are you working with when you say we put water sources?
With a whole group of people, but it would be mostly the Society for the Conservation of Bighorn Sheep, the Foundation for North American Wild Sheep, a Department of California Fish and Game, which is now Fish and Wildlife, and other groups. And the Marine Corps would actually listen to us. I mean, they had a mission on the 29 Palms base to of course, train troops, not take care of sheep. But they actually let us put water sources out there for the sheep. And these groups of sheep were going to be coming off the Newberries. That was the plan, to attract Newberry sheep and then attract sheep from the sheep holes into the 29 Palms. Well, this worked better than we ever thought, because the 29 Palms base is shot up pretty bad with artillery and bombs and all that kind of stuff. But that equals pulverized dirt, and that's minerals. And when we added the water, which was absent, we got sheep. And this sheep now brought in new genetics from all over, because they were connected to the Sheephole Mountains, which connects into the Joshua Tree National Park and down into the other park there, the Mojave Reserve. So we were bringing in genetics across the 29 Palms into the Newberries. And of course, Newberry genetics was flowing to these other populations, the metapopulations, as they call them. So between the new DNA, the new minerals, old mineral sources that have been long, they hadn't had sheep. Like for instance, one of the springs, Sheep Springs of all things, that I had known about for 40 years, had never seen a sheep or any sign of sheep there. Now has sheep there all the time, because the population came up, they rediscovered it, and it's a water mineral source.
Did you have to somehow change or develop pre-existing sources to catch water or to further enhance the availability of water, Carlos?
Well, we did that. We did enhance some. And we also, but mostly we put in artificial water sources. For instance, the Newberry Guzzler, which is one of the first ones, long story on it, but it was put in 86 as kind of mitigation for the quarry. But in a sense replaced Newberry Springs, which used to be a spring right behind the store at Newberry that's filled a swimming pool. When I was there as a kid in the 60s, it was a swimming pool. This water came right out of the crack in the rock and filled the swimming pool right at the foot of the mountain.
Wow.
Well, you could see that back in the ancient times, that would have been, sheep heaven, but it was built up and then the water table was pumped. And so that all these springs that the sheep had once been able to access were dry and the mineral sources along with them. So as we replaced these different water sources and tamarisk growth that had blocked, tamarisk is an exotic plant that sucks a lot of springs dry. We burned them off, chopped them off, controlled them, and many springs or other springs, not many, because we're not talking about a lot of water sources here, but they're critical. And they came back. They came back with water.
How many springs do you think are now, or water sources are now available in the Newberries because of your efforts?
Well, natural sources come and go. Like there's one called Shooting Springs. It'll go dry for 10 years at a time, and it's dry now. But the really good sources, maybe 6 or 8.
That's all,
depending on how you count. That's it. Yeah.
Yeah. And you're talking about an area, how big? How many square miles would the Newberry Mountains or the metapopulation of the desert bighorn sheep be that are in that particular geographical province?
Well, that's complicated, but the Newberries, what we call the Newberry population is really more properly should be called the Ord Mountain population. And right now it's active with the East Ord, West Ord, and Ord Mountain, to be confusing, the Rodman Mountains and the Newberries. And if you go from the Rodman Mountains, the far end, the east of them to the end of the West Ords, you're talking 40 miles, 50 miles.
Okay.
And probably just about as wide an area. But then they're spilling off like the 29 Palms base. I consider that the herd starting a whole new population of like 50 to 100 animals.
So we're talking about something 50 miles wide by 50 miles long, something like that.
For the main event.
The main concentration.
And then they're now spilling off into like Lucerne Valley in that way. And so you probably have 300 to 400 head in the Newberry Rodman Ords.
Now they believe that there's that many.
There's that many, pretty much.
How did that happen? Was it then? When did we see this evolution from 25 to 300 or 400?
It started about 2008, 2009, when it really started. We really started putting the water out in the 29 Palms base. They had the water at the quarry, and then the genetics and all this started happening. And we got genetics now through captures that show sheep from genetics from 100 miles away. And the Newberries.
So they attract other animals that in-migrate and then sort of mix with the herd.
Yeah, the herds are breaking up and coming together. A group of rams might be a big group of rams is 12, in the same way with the ewes, 10, 12 is about all you ever see together. But a lot of times you'll get 10 or 12 together. They'll be together for a week and then just split apart. And, 6 one way, 8 another. And a lot of times an old ewe will just take off on her own, or an old ram. Young rams, they'll get kicked out of the ewe herd and they'll go kind of on a soul journey, kind of. You'll find them in the darndest places. And they then remember, they said, man, I went out here and found this spring. Well, his ancestors knew about that spring for 10,000 years, but he didn't know about it. Now he goes back and eventually becomes a mature ram and decides, I'm just going to go out that spring. And his 4 or 5 younger rams go with him. Boom, now they know where that spring is too.
Cool.
And so it becomes part of the herd memory.
So there's two levels to this next question. I know it's complicated, but give me a picture of, let's say, the pre-contact activities relating to bighorn. Who hunted them and how many did they get? And then who were the major predators of the bighorn sheep in pre-contact times? And then fast forward to modern times, talking about what can affect sheep mortality and sheep viability.
So there would have been probably two eras of pre-contact, which would have been the little pluvial when they were probably in the thousands, probably 10,000 animals or more. Who knows? I nobody really knows. And this would have been the time of the Newberry Caves, the petroglyphs, whatever the population. It was probably a large population.
Got it.
And again, centered on it like the Indians with the buffalo and so on. And the Newberry Cave and the Newberry area, because it had springs and had minerals, had salts, would have been kind of like a conveyor belt to bring animals in. So it would have been a very interesting place because the people could have gone out, killed 10 animals to feed maybe a tribe of 40 or 50, and then a week later go out and kill another 10 animals, and then a week later another 10 animals, because the way the structure of the environment, all the way up into the Ords and the Rodmans, the East Ords and West Ords, would eventually, in the habitat, the habits of the animals would have naturally said, I'm going to wander down in here. Oh, there's not much activity. And then they'd end up down by the Newberry Caves and get hunted. And then when they got hunted out, another one. So there would have been a kind of a conveyor belt at that time, I believe, of bringing animals in. Now, just prior to contact, we'd call, the 10th century or something like that. I don't know.
Yeah.
Before Columbus or even after Columbus.
So AD 1000, AD 1500.
Yeah, there would have been, and really right up until the 1880s, the Native Americans still would have hunted that. But the Newberry Caves wouldn't have had a water source. The sheep would have had to come down into the other Newberry Springs. The population was lower because the desert was under more severe conditions. And then the Native Americans were probably mostly situated, they lived along the Mojave River probably at that time more than Newberry Caves area.
Because there's water there, yeah.
There was water there, but the Newberry Caves kind of show very limited occupation during the time of the bow and arrow.
Definitely. Now, what animals are the key predators, the natural predators, independent of human hunting, Native American hunting, that might affect the numbers of bighorn that existed in the desert?
Really, human beings, when they were really dependent on them, and really the only other one that was significant would be the mountain lion.
Okay.
The bobcat and the coyote, they will pick off stuff, when they can. But I've actually seen bobcat and coyote either ignored or actually run off by sheep. In fact, one time I seen one where they stomped one to death, a young coyote.
Whew.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. I didn't actually see the action, but I was there probably 10 minutes after it happened.
So those bighorn sheep can be mean.
Yeah. And I've seen one time a couple of ewes, and they had lambs. And they were on pretty flat ground, and there was a bobcat following them. And it was a young bobcat, and he was sneaking and doing all this like stealth stuff. And they were like turning their back on him. They were ignoring him. Like they wouldn't let him get close.
Got it.
But you could tell they were not freaked out about him. If he'd have tried to pounce, he'd have gotten the short end of that.
Well, let's take a break. When we come back, let's do a fast forward into modern times and talk about what happened to that Newberry herd and what's been going on lately.
You may have heard my pitch for membership. It's a great idea and really helps out. However, you can also support us by picking up a fun t-shirt, sticker, or something from a large selection of items from our TeePublic store. Head over to arcpodnet.com/shop for a link. That's arcpodnet.com/shop to pick up some fun swag and support the show.
Welcome back to the Rock Art Podcast on the Archaeological Podcast Network. This is Dr. Alan Garfinkel, president of the California Rock Art Foundation, sponsoring this podcast. This is the third and final segment. We've got Carlos Gallinger talking about bighorn sheep in the Newberries and about bighorn sheep rock art and the religious activities that Native people are associated with bighorn sheep, and what happened to that bighorn sheep herd from almost being decimated and becoming extinct to absolutely proliferating. So, Carlos, why don't we fast forward to somewhat of the modern times? How's that?
Yeah, so that kind of brings up to modern times and kind of what I've long been trying to understand the land and the animals in a traditional based way. Of course, I'm a modern hunter and I don't have the prospect of hunger and starvation, looming over me, or going back to my family and saying, to my wife, give me that little cup of seeds you got and I'll eat it. And maybe tomorrow I'll bring food, or the next day, you don't have that, which the ancient people often hunted with a level of desperation that we don't have, but also they tried to integrate themselves to the world, the creation, the universe, in ways that we sometimes forget. For instance, in later times, not the time of the glyphs, many of these men would have hunted bighorn sheep with a horn bow, a bighorn bow made out of a bighorn with a snoo from the bighorn. And you can only imagine trying and wrapped in a serape of a bighorn with a headdress, and you can only imagine the sense of integration that these guys had. You're hunting with a horn bow, or you're trying to fake the sheep that you're a sheep, so you got to behave like the sheep.
You have a sense of veneration and religious association for the bighorn.
Yeah, because from practicality you have philosophy, and that's just a step. Philosophy is just another name sometimes for religion, So this still exists amongst modern hunters. Now, many modern hunters are clueless, and a lot of people that they like to go out and hike and do things. They don't have that sense of the cosmos. But a modern hunter, he's trying to dress to look like the very earth. I mean, when I get out with other hunters, you kind of look and say, well, is his camo better for this than mine? I've been with modern hunters. In fact, one of the hunts in the Newberries, we were making the stock, and there was. It's a long story, but there was a lot of us there. It was a guided hunt. There was probably about 8 of us making the move to choke up on this animal that turned out to be a very large trophy animal.
Let's back up for one complete second, and let's tell the audience what happened in terms of to allow us to even hunt after there hasn't been an approved hunt in a century in the Newberry Mountains.
Well, they went from 25 animals to about 400.
400 animals.
And they had what they call a lamb to ewe ratio. You have 100 ewes or females. How many lambs survive? Okay. That's called the lamb to ewe ratio.
Okay.
And the Newberries was hitting sometimes because they were helicopter surveying.
Yes.
We were getting anywhere from 60 to 70 lambs per ewe. 100 lambs, 70 lambs, as much as 70 lambs per 100 ewes.
Which is huge, right?
Which is huge. It's an exploding population. You can get by on like 10, if you have 10 lambs that survive per 100 ewes, you're getting okay. You won't wipe out, but you're not doing good. You're probably going down a little bit.
So you had almost a population explosion going on in the Newberries.
It was a population explosion. And so it was opened up to hunting just recently. And I was on this hunt. I was invited because the people knew that I understood the Newberries. And what I was getting at is kind of how you see it. We were making this stock.
What do you mean stock?
Well, we'd seen the animal. We decided to try to make the kill. And we were closing in, and most of us weren't going to get that close, but we were closing in. And as we did, the wind shifted, And without a word, you could see everybody with just a sense like of fear and freezing, like everybody just froze. And today, that's not a common understanding. Most people will backpack and the wind could shift and this and that, and they're oblivious to it. But yet the wind shapes the mountains. It shapes the behavior of the sheep. It's an invisible force that is made visible to those who understand it.
Got it. Explain to the audience, though, why the hunt was approved and what animals are allowed to be hunted in order to, I guess, reduce the population selectively so that they could remain vital, vibrant, and reproduce.
Well, it kind of comes in with a conversation we actually had the other day.
Okay.
The population is usually 50-50, 50 rams, 50 ewes, male, female, and maybe only 10-15% of the rams breed in any one year, and many of them will breed for about 5 years if they're lucky. So if you get an inbred group, that one ram is pretty much breeding his daughters and his granddaughters. And so if you take them out of the population, there's actually some benefit to it. There's a formula where the line crosses the eye and all this. California's got a weird one, of course, but you got to take a big ram. You can't take a ewe or a lamb or anything like that.
So when you say a big ram, it's an old ram, isn't it?
Right. The other day when you called me,
yes,
we were going up into the Newberries, actually, and not that far from the caves.
Okay.
To check on a ram. We'd got there the day before. We were to scout out to fill water for them. And there was this big ram, and he was dying.
Oh, wow.
He made it to the water source, and we walked up to the water. We didn't even notice him right off the get-go. He was laying there in the dirt, eyes closed. He just barely opened his eyes to acknowledge our existence. I walked right up to him, and finally he stood up, but I mean, he just barely stood up. Dirt in his mouth. He was just on his last legs. No sooner than I turned my back to him, he just collapsed right in his tracks. He was, wow. And of course, he was a big, nice ram. I've got some pictures of him. And this is the kind of thing that, instead of just having an animal die like that, we can harvest them, as we call it. And
yes,
and there's a lot of money brought in from people trying to get this tag. I've tried to get the Newberry or a sheep tag in California for 36, 37 years and have never been able to do it.
So in order to hunt legally, you must obtain a tag. And to obtain a tag, usually you must pay a price, correct?
Well, you pay there's several ways. You enter a lottery. It's like $10-20 a year. If you get it, then you pay another $250 and you go to a class. And then after the class, you're given a tag and you can get one mature ram out of a particular zone, not just anywhere. And the Newberries was opened up out of the 400 some animals, mind you, 400 plus another 50 or 100 in the 29 Palms base. So pushing 500 animals, we had 6 tags.
I see.
And that was considered a lot, actually. I was on 2 of those hunts, and I tell you, one of them, I was in an area that had a lot of Indian hunting camps. There was 3 father and son teams there at the kill. I was there, and I had been there with my father, and there was just kind of a lineage, at least in my mind. I was almost in tears walking back. We got back late at night. It was a long, drawn-out hunt and stalk, but it was well worth it, and it was just, you'd have to understand the land in the ancient way to really appreciate that, that you were there, the ancient people were there, they were there with their own lineage, where some hunter was saying, my father taught me this about this place, my grandfather taught me this, and I heard my great-grandfather killed a sheep right on that, and so on. And that was how it was in the ancient times. And it just was really to see the ancient way still there.
So in other words, you had that same sort of tradition and generational connection some sort of
Yes.
almost a cosmic or ethereal tether connecting you to the native people and the land and the animals who walk the land and the wind.
The wind, the phase of the phase of the moon, the temperature, the condition of the plants, when a wash ran the last time, all this kind of stuff.
It's almost a religious experience.
Yeah, because it's all consuming. Every plant, every rock. In this place, there was no glyphs that I know of, but there are metates and places where they were working and tuning up the tips, their arrowheads,
Yeah.
or spear points.
Wow.
And so when you get this kind of stuff, you begin to realize that there's a depth to it. And I think that's what the glyphs is, a doorway to understanding that, because they're not random in their placement, and they're not random in the sense that they're just a squiggly, doodly line. They actually had meaning. They were made by a particular human trying to convey a particular thought, and that's a thought. When you see that glyph, that's somebody's thought in a given time and place, in a given time, like within minutes. Somebody said, I need to put this symbol, this message, and I know that it's going to last longer than me.
So when we think about rock art, even in the Desert West especially, if there was one particular animal symbol that is the number one symbol found on certainly rock drawings, petroglyphs, it is the bighorn sheep, isn't it?
Yeah, by far. Now, others, lizards I've seen, and deer show up from time to time. There's stuff that people think are quail feathers.
Mm-hmm.
I've seen what is almost certainly a Gila monster. And there's other animals that show up once in a while. But as a motif and something that's really anchored in their mainstream culture, it's the bighorn sheep.
And why do you think that was the case? What is it about the bighorn sheep that has such an obsession or passion for people, a symbol? And what would be the draw? What would be the motivation for people to be so fixated by the image and the being of a bighorn sheep?
Well, it gets to masculinity. It gets to, religion. The bighorn would have been one of the biggest animals there. To actually get him, they're very elusive. You have to be physically fit, mentally fit. You have to bring home a bighorn sheep into the camp would have been proof that you were in tune with the cosmos, both in our scientific kind of understanding, but also in the philosophical and spiritual understanding of those people, because you couldn't have done it without it. If you didn't understand the wind, if you couldn't say, well, the moon was this, so, shining bright or dim, or so the sheep might have behaved in this way last night. If you weren't in cosmic tune, you can't hunt a sheep. You'll fail. And so it is a status. It is a trophy. It's a trophy now, and it was a trophy back then. But now the trophy has kind of a negative connotation to it, whereas in their world and in the hunting world, the modern world, that's a status symbol that means something because of what the sheep is, because to out-sheep the sheep is something. Most people today will never go into the field and say, I'm trying to get real close to a desert bighorn sheep and succeed in it. That is a very difficult thing to do. And so you see it in the art. Now, a lot of the art, you see ewes and lambs, but the rams are often with horns way out of proportion for their body size. So we know that this was a status, a male, just like, eagle feathers for the Great Plains. The eagles didn't fly down and sell their feathers for $2 or something. You had to hunt eagles. And if you were out on the Great Plains, to hunt an eagle to success was an accomplishment. You just didn't do it for food.
So, Carlos, what's the takeaway from all of this? How can someone perhaps access more information, since we're kind of closing in on the end of our third round here? Can they get a hold of you?
Yeah, for a lot of this, you can go for more in-depth stuff. You can go to my website, which is thewayoftthings.org, and I got articles and videos that are along these lines. And for something more lighter, I have a Facebook that's The Way of Things, or you can look it up by my name, Carlos Gallinger, and it's usually just, maybe a sentence or a photograph or maybe just a paragraph in scope.
Well, Carlos, it's been a great treat for our audience and for me as well to hear your lifelong perspective on bighorn sheep. With that, all you folks out in podcast world, thanks for tuning in. Have a good week.
Thanks for listening to the Rock Art Podcast with Dr. Alan Garfinkel and Chris Webster. You can find this podcast on the educational podcast app Lyceum, Lyceum, and wherever you find podcasts. Find show notes and contact information at www.arcpodnet.com/rockart. Thanks for listening, and thanks for sharing this podcast with your family and friends. This show is produced and recorded by the Archaeology Podcast Network, Chris Webster and Tristan Boyle, in Reno, Nevada, at the Reno Collective.
This has been a presentation of the Archaeology Podcast Network. Visit us on the web for show notes and other podcasts at www.arcpodnet.com. Contact us at chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com.
Thanks again for listening to this episode and for supporting the Archaeology Podcast Network. If you want these shows to keep going, consider becoming a member for just $7.99 US a month. That's cheaper than a venti quad eggnog latte. Go to arcpodnet.com/members for more info.